Tskhay, who's our speaker today. We're here to present a book about global norms compliance. The format is going to be slightly different from the format we usually adopt for our webinars, because today we're going to have a 30 minutes presentation, 10-15 minutes discussion, and then we will open up the floor for Q&A so that all the participants will have an opportunity to ask you a few questions. And now, without any further ado, Aliya, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for hosting me. It's such a pleasure to be, although virtually in Nazarbayev University and the GSPP. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about my book, which is here. And I'll try to share my screen, hopefully with some success. Bear with me. And if anyone can tell me whether you see the presentation, that'd be great. Yeah, yeah, great.
Yes, we can see.
Great, fantastic. So yes, I'm Aliya Tskhay. I'm based in the University of St. Andrews in School of Management at the moment, and I want to start with a little bit of like a pre-story of how this book came around and what was the inspiration towards it, and some of the prior assumptions that I had about the research and the topic. So first and foremost, it's based on my doctorate thesis that I successfully defended in 2016 at the University of St. Andrews for the PhD in international relations. And this is kind of a little bit a bigger version of what the PhD thesis was about. But all in all, you can tell once I started doing research on the topic of EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, it took me 7 years. So it's quite a long process, and it's quite a big chunk of time and energy that I dedicated to this particular book. And the reason why I was doing this research, so I started with the assumption of, I was quite interested about the energy sector, and that is understanding the energy policies, specifically in Kazakhstan, coming from Kazakhstan myself, but in general in a bigger region of Caspian, so looking at Azerbaijan and how these post-Soviet states are actually dealing with the developments in the oil and gas sector and the profits that are making out of it, and how it impacts the economic and social and political life in these countries. At the same time, during my read up about the topic of energy, I stumbled across this interesting initiative, which is called Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I will talk about it later more in detail. But the idea was like that both Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan were participating in it. And that caught my eye and attention. So why these countries are there, why they're interested. And the other, once I started my PhD, actually, one of the reasons was also what attracted me to this topic in particular was that I wanted to study norms, and norms in the understanding of how these kind of standards or rules are transmitted, or how are they translated into different countries from international cooperation field or international society, you can also say that. And so how are they born and how do they develop? And it's very rare to actually notice that moment of the emergence of the norms, because again, EITI is very new norm relatively. It's not human rights or it's not anti-mine law. So not something that was established 50 or 60 years ago, but it's something very much present in the 21st century, and it's developing very, very quickly. So from the theoretical perspective, it was very interesting also to capture that moment of the norm development. So having said that, I want to present a little bit of the structure of the book, and where you have these, again, and that's where you will see that it comes out of the PhD thesis. You have a typical theoretical discussion on norms and norms literature, and all the discussions about compliance. What does it mean? What kind of actors are involved in these processes? So, for example, norm entrepreneurs, and norm life cycles, different kinds of models and modeling that the experts applied to understand how the norms develop. Then I proceed to discuss what EITI is. And it's very, very important that I focus on what EITI is, because it's a very particular process and it works in a particular way. So understanding how that technicality works also was important and informed me a lot to discuss the case studies. I have 4 case studies: Norway, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Azerbaijan. And at one point, you may seem it's a very random choice of countries. At the same time, there is a very underlying logic behind the case study selection, which I discuss in the book, but I also will tell you about once I delve into the case studies. But the idea is exactly to look at the EITI countries or the EITI member states and looking at particular different kind of combination of factors within that. And then I finish up with a chapter in conclusion about the implications for further research. And today, in the talk today, I will talk about a little bit of what I would like to do after this book. So sort of a more open-ended discussion about the further research in general in my trajectory, but also in the field. One thing that I also want to note is that if you look at the case studies, you might think that like, oh, they're very, very different case studies. At the same time, my desire always was not to portray these are the bad states and these are the good states, or these are the ones that follow the rules, these are the ones that don't follow the rules. In my understanding, I look at a very equal level playing field. And each particular state has its own problems. And each particular state had its own benefits and also progressive events as well. And hence, it makes a very interesting story to look at them, not from a normative perspective, which is important to make a difference. I'm talking about norms, non-normative. So I don't judge any state. I actually take them at face value. And I don't really apply any kind of normative judgments onto the labeling these countries. But at the same time, it's important to look at the processes that happened within each one of it. And yeah, so moving to the theoretical framework, which I think is a little bit important to touch upon. And again, I'll be happy to discuss it in the Q&A if anyone wants to go into the more discussion about this. But I generally take a constructivist approach and understanding norms and how the norms are created or co-constructed. And there are 2 particular definitions of norms that I adopt. One is by Finemore and Sicking in their very, very famous international organization article. Standards, it's a standard of a behavior. And the other one, which is also important, but it's kind of more an elaborated version of the standard of behavior, is a standard of behavior, but which is repeated and replication of particular action or behavior by state. Why it is important is that EITI is actually an action. So it's a very process that defines an action. Being transparent is an action. And it's and that standardization of behavior is also important. The EITI presents a very formatted version of how this transparency should work. And hence, following that format is very, very crucial. I look at about 3 different norm life cycle models. So there's the, again, the one that was presented by Finemore and Sicking, which is the very linear presentation of how norms develop. And in that model in particular, what is crucial for my understanding of norm development is that norms spread out due to this critical mass. So critical mass of states and actors that embrace the norm and then push it forward. In this kind of, there is different a spiral representation, that's a more updated version, which was done by Bristrop and Sikking in their book. And that kind of spiral representation was a critique of the linear model that the Finnemore and Sikking represented, and then it included more about also involving the local actors and the perspectives from local actors on the norm implementation and norm compliance. However, all of these models necessarily do not look at the local dynamics, so what's happening inside each particular state. What their emphasis is mostly, and you would understand because they're all international relations scholars, so they look at the international structures as such. And the emphasis, what is also important, is that they're all Western scholars, so they're not necessarily looking at the other regions. The idea is that the norms are developed by these particular set of norm entrepreneurs, usually a Western country, and it is then spread around the world and kind of embraced by all the other countries. There are certain pressures implemented from outside. So for example, especially in human rights, they mentioned you have particular states that are very adamant about human rights and implementation of human rights and compliance with the legislation agreements. And that kind of pressure is put on the countries to be more compliant with the international agreements. However, what I was looking at while doing the research on the ground is that that necessarily applies. You have some particular issues and some particular factors inside each state that also influence the uptake of the norm. So in my research, I then came up with my own norm implementation model. And you can see that it's a more, I want to say, a more comprehensive look at it. But even more so, the innovation that I thought was important to include was this critical juncture field. And critical juncture, to me, is crucial for several reasons, but particularly for the fact that it can capture the moment, the kind of critical mass moment for when the norm is born, when the norm is actually entering the mindset of a particular stakeholders, and then it started to be embraced and implemented further. So I will talk about the critical juncture in some of the case studies, which would make it more understandable. But if you think about it, like what a kind of an event that triggers the process of norm implementation, this is what I'm talking about when I mention critical juncture. Then you have the three phases, which is norm commitment, norm internalization, and then norm compliance. And then you have three factors that influence each phase: norm legitimacy, state actions, and domestic international pressures. For each particular states, you have different type of works that are there. Work that needs to be done on norm legitimization, on state actions to commit to a norm or to implement the norm or to comply with the norm. And there are particular domestic and international pressures that need to be to push the actors, especially the governments and political elites, to commit or to comply with the norm. And again, I'm happy to discuss this even more in the Q&A. But let me bring your attention to the EITI. So what is in the EITI? EITI is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And as they define it, it implements the global standard to promote the open and accountable management of oil and gas and mineral resources. EITI, it's a little bit confusing because EITI is a standard. So it's a standard on how to report such data on the revenues from oil and gas and other mineral resources. But it's also an organization. It's an organization with the 55 countries members currently. And it was established in 2003 with headquarters in Oslo. in Norway. And what is important about this process is that it has every year revising its rules. So every year there is a more kind of defined way and precise understanding of how the rules should be applied and what should be included into the report. So far, 2.7 trillion US dollars in revenues were disclosed by this process, and 95% of the data are online and available to the public. So it's, if you think about the secretive nature of energy and the secretive nature of oil and gas deals and the revenues that resource-rich countries make, this process is trying to tackle that and open up that data to anyone, to the public, and especially dedicated to the citizens of the resource-rich countries. So how does the process work? Well, you have a national multi-stakeholder groups, which is civil society, governments, and businesses working together as equals. Every major decision-making has to be done consensually, and every particular stakeholder, which is business or civil society, are crucial to the process. So they cannot not participate in it. And this is all done to ensure that the process is accountable, the process is open and cross-verified. So what does the process do actually is you collect all the necessary documents such as contracts and licenses, all the data on the production and on revenue collection, and then you collate that information through also the data on revenue allocation and social economic spending in a way, which if I give you an example is that which if the company A paid so much so in taxes, so how much taxes went to the national budget or to the local budget or to build a particular project such as hospital or school or any other social and economic project. And this data is then verified by an independent auditor and then published as a report in local languages and English, and then it's made available online. Here's the map of the EITI members, and I want to bring your attention again to the, it is important to know who is participating in the membership, and it's quite big in terms of its global presence, but at the same time who's also absent. So you have big mineral resource based and energy resource rich countries such as Canada and the United States and Australia. They are not part of the EITI, and or Russia or China, and it's very, very important that EITI is not covering all of the revenues as such. Now, if I move on to the case studies, so I start with the I have a particular type of a presentation of the chapters, and I start from Norway. And again, I deliberately do that because Norway is an interesting case of, it used to be the only European or Western, if you call it, country to be part of the EITI. And it's not by chance that it was like that, because EITI headquarters is in Oslo, and from the beginning, the Norwegian government was supporting through its aid and financial support for the organization and for the standard itself. It deemed it a very important foreign policy priority, so to show and lead by example. So what can countries actually do? And the interesting part of it was that some of the information that was available through the EITI was already open by other governmental sources in Norway. So the logic behind subscribing to the EITI process was not really clear, even in Norway. So some of them say, why do we have to do double reporting in a way? And at the same time, Norway was very, very and the Norwegian government was very, very clear that they need to be part of this very important initiative, because it can be a trailblazer, not only to the other countries, developing countries, to follow and help them out in their path to the opening up the information, but also to the other Western nations to showing how this can be achieved. And also, in a way, it was a very important domestic discussion between the civil society, and very active civil society, and the government, and the particular government that was in place. And it was actually, again, these kind of conversations that we're having that were around the oil and gas and the use of oil and gas revenues that are happening constantly inside Norway. This very uncomfortable conversation sometimes, and you can hear it even now in the news about whether Norway should continue oil production or not due to the environmental impact. These kind of conversations were part of the social kind of structure in Norway, but it led to the fact that it is important for Norway to be part of the EITI process. And the politicians were convinced of such benefit. The other question that is raising is about social awareness. So the Norwegian population is very aware about the processes surrounding the oil and gas sector, and very aware of its impact, but not necessarily aware of how much actually in terms of revenue Norway actually makes. And not necessarily people are aware about the EITI process either. So it's an interesting dynamic that I saw, that although Norway, if you can look at it process-wise, had a very kind of linear and clear-cut progression to compliance, they didn't really have any problems along the way. At the same time, the impact that it has on the society is much, much bigger. And if we move on to, for example, Kazakhstan, here where it's already a very different picture. Kazakhstan, I start with this very big assumption that Kazakhstan needs EITI as part of the country's image and reputation campaign to portray the country as dedicating towards these international standards, especially standards that are aimed at foreign investors and investors coming into the very important for the country energy sector. And that was probably one of the first, or one of the few of the processes in terms of opening up data on a very, very strategically important and to some extent sensitive area of energy. There were particular personal involvements, and here I mean the former president Nazarbayev. He himself first announced at the, and here's very important, and here where I'm talking about the critical juncture, he had a foreign investors forum where he was given a speech, and he announced there that Kazakhstan would join EITI. This was in 2005. So to some people that might say, oh, it is just a speech, it's just a forum. But to me, it's a very symbolic and very crucial aspect that such announcement was not made through the press release or for a minister, but actually the president himself and in front of a foreign investors audience. So here where the commitment is actually made. In Kazakhstan, the EITI process was not that smooth as in Norway. There were some setbacks, and these setbacks were in multiple ways. There were some complications within the civil society and the organization of civil society, because it needs to be, again, you need to understand that this is a very technical issue. We're talking about fiscal policies, we're talking about taxation, we're talking about allocation of resources and licensing. So you need to be really, really prepared and versed into the language and into the data analysis to be really in equal par with the other experts. So for civil society, they needed to catch up a little bit. And at the same time, it was a learning curve for the government itself, because again, how to make sure that the tax office can declare and open up the information as quick as possible, how much we can actually what the legislation needs to change and there was the reform. And actually, importantly, and I think here where a lot of people may misunderstand the EITI, like, oh, it's just about the numbers. No, it's not. It's the impact in Kazakhstan, for example, I could see from the fact that the EITI informed and kind of pushed the change in the legislation, the very important law and code on subsoil use. So all that work that's going behind the EITI actually informs then further implementation and reforms in the sector. And for example, also these innovations within the sector. So Kazakhstan introduced this online portal where you can see the options to see the revenues or the at least the tax codes and tax. I'm losing my word here. The specific data on each company and each project. So it's very, very important, and it was for the first time the Kazakhstan did it. It was a very innovative aspect for EITI itself, and Kazakhstan actually did some workshops and training for the other countries to look at how this was implemented. So you can see that the impact is much bigger than just the reporting. Then I move on to Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyzstan again here is important. It's mostly about mining sector. The mining sector is very particular, so it has some fundamental differences with the oil and gas sector. And in the mining sector, there very fundamental role plays Kumtor mine, and it always has been at the core of these tensions between the government and the foreign investors since Askar Akayev's presidency. What I've seen in Kyrgyzstan, it has been falling out and with the EITI board because it couldn't keep up with the publication of reports. So it has been a lot of fundamental drawbacks in the process. But also what I've noticed that the state capacity is quite limited. And what I mean by that is that the EITI process needs a dedicated personnel. It needs dedicated funding and training. And so for some countries that are struggling with that, not having it necessarily the means, it's hard to keep up. So what we see is that sometimes you can name that, oh, Kyrgyzstan does not comply with EITI. But what does it actually mean? It's not that they don't want to, sometimes they can't due to the technicalities and due to the funding opportunities and so on and so forth. Because also if you want to get funding, you need to apply for it. That takes time, it takes energy. You need to satisfy particular donors and the demands for donors and so on and so forth. And lastly, but not least, is Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan is a very interesting case because it used to be a pilot country. It's the first one to implement the EITI from the beginning, from 2003. It had a very quick progression to compliance. It was a poster country that did all the best, all the new reforms. And then in 2013 and in 2013 and 2014, there became a clash with the EITI board over the treatment of the civil society. I wouldn't go into the politics of it, but the issue was that Azerbaijan was saying that they complied with everything that was required from the EITI in terms of publication of reports and the data information. What the EITI board wanted is like that civil society is a very crucial part of it. So we don't necessarily treat that the reporting issue is only core issue that we care. So Azerbaijan left the EITI, and now, interestingly, it publishes a very similar report. So it does include the information that was originally required, but it doesn't have to comply with the standardization that is now required from the EITI. And if I take the last minutes to talk about what next is norm compliance, and a lot of the literature that I see people dismiss this point is that it's a laborious process, and a lot of things happen within the process. So it's important to keep in mind the technicalities and then the personal stories that are involved in this process. Now, the EITI requirements improve and get more detailed every year. And here, where this, again, learning curve is important, it does require more and more. So, for example, issues like beneficial ownership, gender representation in the sector, environmental impact information are now slowly being integrated into the process, which hasn't been before, certainly not in the beginning. So you see that the area what EITI covers is actually also expanding. And EITI is certainly not a silver bullet. It cannot solve all the problems in this sector. And it only covers the revenue side mostly. So we are not really talking about how these revenues are then used and for what purposes and so on and so forth. And I want to emphasize also the role of professionalism, training, civil society, and to some extent the businessmen and the government official need to be trained, particularly trained, and always constantly updated on how to make data available, how to work with data, how to analyze data. We as academics and experts need to be more familiarized with the processes ourselves in order to make a more in-depth and more credential analysis. And I think what is important for all of the countries that are involved in the EITI is that it's a learning from all of the other countries as well. We need to see what's happening in the other regions and how other regions are tackling issues in order to make a more, not only better use of resources, but better use of the norm itself. And on this note, I want to conclude, and I'm really looking forward to all the questions. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Aliya, for a very interesting presentation. I think there will be plenty of questions. Before we open the Q&A session, I believe we have a little bit of a discussion going on. Johnny Beck, the floor is yours, I assume.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ricardo. And Aliya, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And first of all, my congratulations on this great book. And I think that the value of this book is kind of multifold. First of all, you do a lot of discussion, theoretical discussion on norms. I mean, the norm has been there, one of the major topics when it comes to, at least to the literature on international relations, has been there very much kind of present in the last, I don't know, 20, 25 years. But still, we see that a lot of things still to be discussed. And you do seem that you do a lot of great job when it comes to how norms they diffuse, they travel across borders, how they're localized or how they're rejected sometimes. In that sense, I guess it's a good contribution. Another thing I would like to mention, kind of general thing, is that the empirical chapters, I mean, 4 chapters, and you are absolutely right. When you first look at these 4 cases and you have no idea what is the logic behind of this, I mean, selecting these 4 chapters. But once you read the chapter and you see that, okay, these 4 cases reflect the kind of different degrees of compliance with EITI. In that sense, I guess you did a brilliant job in demonstrating how this newly emerging norm is diffused kind of at different levels in different kind of contexts. In that sense, I guess it's a good job. And other point I would like to mention is, again, how difficult the norm diffusion is. I mean, we've seen the interaction between different kind of actors, including governments, international donors, international investors, businesses, NGOs, international NGOs, all types of international actors, and how they come to interact, to accept the norm or to reject the norm, and how they set the agenda and how they fight with each other to define. Again, it's sometimes, I guess, when we read papers on norms and norm diffusion, we sometimes underestimate the complexity of the whole process, I guess. And also, I mean, you brilliantly illustrate, I guess, that even if in some cases when you have this highest political will to accept this norm, and then we have certain kind of internal actors that become a kind of barrier. For in the case of Norway, I mean, your interviews and your respondents say, okay, I mean, it's a kind of double reporting. We do this, and why we need to do this again, a kind of thing. In the case of Kazakhstan, I mean, until the president himself didn't say this, or until Kulibayev, you mentioned this in the book in 2012, I guess, right, was involved with Kaz Energy. The process was very slow, I guess, right? And you mentioned the role of Otunbayeva, sorry, and Hamaliyev and others. So we see that even if there is a highest political will to implement this, sometimes something goes wrong. And in the case of Kyrgyzstan, it's about the state capacity, right? This country wants to implement this, but again, it doesn't have all capacity to do so. Again, it's a kind of very difficult. So in that sense, I guess, again, it's very rich and both in terms of theory and the empirical kind of things. And the topic of transparency, I guess, it has become a very important topic. I mean, given the recent publications of all this offshore documents, and we see that, okay, there is kind of more questions emerging in societies of these countries, at least in Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan, right? So when it comes to questions, I do have a lot of questions, and I would love to ask all of them. But again, for the sake of time, maybe I'll just leave a couple of them. My first question would be, again, when we look at the literature on norm diffusion, we normally kind of see the three kind of motivation, right? Why states comply with norms or not. The first possibly is the coercion. But in the case of EITI, we don't see any kind of coercion. The second is self-interest, when states comply with the norm, when they see the kind of benefit. The third one is when the states accept the norms as legitimate, and we see the logic of appropriateness. When it comes to your cases, I guess I see kind of a different kind of pattern here, but at least, I don't know, maybe I misunderstood the point. To me, when I read the book, it seemed that Norway on the one hand and other three countries on the other, they are on the different sides of this self-interest and logic of appropriateness, I guess. I mean, when Norway accepts this norm, despite its kind of long history of transparency, let's say, and when Norway intentionally becomes the main norm interpreter to disseminate this norm, what is the interest here? I mean, what is the motivation to do so? Right, but when it comes to Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan, we see clear kind of interest-based kind of motivation. Right, we want a better reputation, we want kind of more investors to come, we want legitimacy, and so on and so forth. So does it mean that okay, we see this difference between logic of appropriateness, maybe logic of consequences between Norway and other three countries? And if it's more about the logic of consequence, or let's say more about interest-based kind of motivation, so does it mean that states, I mean, what it implies when it comes to the long-term sustainability of the EITI, right? When states can comply with this, when they see their self-interest, but when they see that, okay, their interests are now diverging from the EITI, as the case with Azerbaijan, for instance, they can just withdraw from the norm, I mean, from the platform. So what are the implications? When, for me, at least from the reading, it seems that, again, it's more about the interest-based kind of thing, and to what extent it's sustainable in the longer run. So that would be a question, I guess, number one. The second question would be possibly, again, you showed the map, and then before the presentation, I looked at the map as well, and I found there are only 6 kind of European countries, 2 of them being Albania and Ukraine, and other 4 Germany, UK, Norway, and Netherlands. And all of the countries, except a couple of them, I guess, are middle-sized or small-sized countries participating in the EITI. And we don't see there France, we don't see there US, Canada, Australia, Russia, China, and South Africa, I guess. And what does it mean, again, for the future of the EITI? So it seems to me that it's a kind of not supported, at least, by the biggest players in the field, I guess. And I see here several kind of few students who are collecting their data or who are about to collect their data, and some of them are also working on a kind of quite sensitive question. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about your kind of data collection kind of thing. I mean, what would be your suggestion for students we have here? I mean, transparency is a quite sensitive topic, I guess, in Kazakhstan, at least in Azerbaijan, and how you manage to contact those people and ask your questions, and what would be kind of strategy that you, so just briefly, if you can elaborate on this. And thank you very much for the topic, for the presentation.
Thank you. If you allow me, I'll delve straight into them. Or yeah, fantastic questions. I think it's one of the interesting conundrums that you have here in the EITI, and that's why it's very exciting for me to work on it, is you have countries that are norm entrepreneurs, but also norm implementers. So they kind of start implementing along the way, and they also have to promote it simultaneously, which not necessarily happened before, I would assume. And hence, this is a very difficult job for each country to juggle, because you have to understand why you implement the norm, but also how can you push the others to do the same. And here I would kind of disagree with you, Geneviève, but in a way that I think there are multiple logics that are at play. There's certainly self-interest, and self-interest is different for each country. So for Norway, the self-interest was to have this kind of to support that image of the country as well, that is transparent, that it dedicates itself to the notions of open government, to the notions of effective use of resources and the revenues from oil and gas, because it does that as well through its programs on foreign aid, for example. So it has it needs to dedicate time, and it needs to uphold such an image, not only for the sake of the image, but also because they are actually implementing projects in other countries and on the Norwegian aid money. Hence, they need to delegitimize that work. So that kind of legitimation also plays into a very important role. And here also, like each one of the countries have this self-interest to participate, be it financial assistance, be it attracting more foreign investors, be it learning about the field. And I would say that each one, like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and in Norway, they all learned about how better to use the resources, how to make it more efficient, how to make it process easier, how to collaborate. It's a very interesting collaboration also. So these interests are also changing, and the legitimacy of it, because the EITI is such a new kind of emerging norm, the legitimacy grows the more the basis of the country membership grows, the more the countries can show, well, this is how much. And it's not by chance that I use the statistics that they publish on the EITI website. It's very important and very impressive figures, like $2.7 trillion. And they do that because, again, they try to legitimize the process itself. And so hence that legitimacy grows. And what is also important to note, that you have countries that are members, but you also have private companies that are also part of they're not necessarily members, but they adhere to the process. And you have very, very big and influential multinational corporations there. So even though, for example, Australia is not, but some of the Australian mining companies are there, because they also operate in other countries that are EITI members. So you have this kind of cross collaboration. And that brings legitimacy as well. If the corporations, if big mining corporations are part of this process, they also understand why it is important, and for countries like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or other developing nations that are interested in attracting foreign investors, they would look at also, or maybe participating in EITI might help in kind of bringing those investors in. On the question about the absent EITI countries, it's a big issue for the EITI as an organization. And there are many political questions why particular states are not there, or what prevents particular governments to kind of participate. And it's not only Russia or Australia or Canada, it's also Middle East, so Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, very big oil producers, right? So it's a big aspect of it. It's also the issue about EITI is a voluntary process. So there couldn't be any coercion, and there couldn't be any forceful kind of signing up agreement. And it's voluntary to stay within the process. You have to adhere once you're inside the system, you have to adhere to it, but at the same time, you can leave at any point and you can join at any point. So that makes it a little bit more on a weaker side, right? There was a big discussion in the US, for example, the US at some point was moving to join the EITI, and then it kind of retracted. So although, and I think one of the reasons why Norway was very kind of keen to be there is that to incentivize these countries to be part of it. But not necessarily, again, if you look back into the Fillmore and Sikkim, I don't think that necessarily among those kind of states there is a critical mass yet to join. On the other side, there were always these discussions about, oh, why it's only developing countries that are implementing EITI, why the Western countries? And so all the West, you keep on saying that you have to be transparent and stuff, but you don't adhere to the same. So it's a discussion about also double standards in a way, that whether you agree to it or not. But I think it's a very important process to look at how these countries are leading the way into showing how much actually transparency can be achieved. And that it's not, and also for me, it was very, very important. And that's why in the book, you would see that I don't really deal with it. It's not about democracy, and it's not about the political structures or political systems. And it's not necessarily about the West or the other countries or development and not developing. It's about, again, that dedication to and commitment to a particular set of norms. And there are different ways to demonstrate that, and the EITI is one of them. On the data collection, I think my advice would be, it's always good to be to have very realistic expectations of what you can achieve and what you can find. I never wanted to go in deep, darker secrets. As such, it was not my goal, and it's not. I'm not a journalist, and I don't want to do that. And there are other people who might do that. My goal was actually to just tell a story about the process. And if you portray the light, and you are yourself as a researcher very transparent with your participants about what you want to achieve and what you want to learn, you can find that kind of openness as well, I find. It's a very laborious process. It took me 1 year to collect the data. And mine was very, very small and specific. So it requires time, it requires trust, it requires, again, networks and establishing contacts. At the same time, I was, maybe within this research, I was lucky enough that most of the information was already open in the open access. And I found that a lot of people, especially to talk about the EITI, they were very happy because it's actually one of the good examples in a way to talk about. And still EITI is kind of getting this more recognition about it. So if I can tell you, yeah, be patient, be open, have realistic expectations, but also if you're persistent enough, I think, yeah, you can find the information you need.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Professor Howie. And then Dr. Thomas Kevin Beto.
Thank you, Aliya, for the interesting presentation. I just want to go back to Norway because I believe that there's got to be there's got to be just a supply of sort of the idea of providing accounts to the public, but there also got to be a demand from the public for this. And people sometimes forget that the first round of resource revenues from Norway were squandered badly, and the government didn't do a very good job of it. So I was curious with respect to Norway, one of the reasons why it's been so successful is because of its history of squandering its resource rents at the beginning of its finding of oil in the North Sea. And if you don't have the demand side from the public, how effective is EITI going to be?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, because also here again the discussion is important about what kind of social contract you have in each particular state. So what relationship between the public and the government you have. And in Norway, even before the oil boom, they had a very particular type of understanding of how the relationship goes, and that kind of accountability of the government, which is very, very important for the process like transparency and extractive industries. The other factor here is also, I think that's why it was portrayed a lot by the participants in my study, that Norway can demonstrate the whole learning curve that they had over the course of the years, which is 5 or 6 decades of learning about the energy sector, of learning about how to operate, of the mistakes they've had, and they can demonstrate that knowledge to the other countries together with the transparency. That was part of and it's part of what the Norwegian government does. Again, that's in terms of its foreign policy. It's also a very kind of I think it's a case about how much the government, and particular type of government, and here I mean whether it's left-leaning or right-leaning, and so on and so forth, how much they're interested in EITI. So for example, now Norway doesn't publish EITI reports, but they publish all the consolidated information into the portal, because they said we don't have the demand from the public or interest from the public to download these EITI reports or to distribute it. But we see that some people are still interested in getting the data, so they can go online and see it and ask questions, or as journalists can have a look at it and then report. So it's also about, again, the government is trying to make better use of resources, but also reflecting on what the demand is from the public. I think also in Norway, the revenues question is not necessarily the problematic question when you would find any other energy resource question. Because in Norway, the question is how that money is then used, or how much actually Norway or Norwegian companies operate in other countries. That's even more interesting to the Norwegian public themselves, I find. So again, what kind of particular interest public has in this area is also an important. And by all means, I think Norway is not the brightest shining star in this process. It also has its issues. And there have been crucial moments where the government said, like, well, we don't necessarily want to spend our taxpayers' money on this. Why are we still here? Is it important? We do that anyway. But it still continues to do that with different. And I think even more so, EITI in Norway will morph into this very, very more important area when we talk about climate and the environmental impact. And here, I think this would be a thorny issue for the Norwegian government, between the Norwegian government and the Norwegian population, because most of the population would like to stop, and the government doesn't. So what's the dynamic and how EITI can actually solve it or not solve it?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's Aliya.
Oh, yes, Aliya, thank you for your presentation. Actually, this topic falls into my research area as well. So I have a couple of questions, if you allow me. So first of all, I would like to clarify, did you compare countries with 4 case studies among themselves, or did you consider them like separate from each other. The reason is that Norway can be considered as a benchmark still, because there is a headquarter and it is like a best implementer, let's say, of and the norm compliant country so far in the EITI context. So this is my first question. My second question is about, you may know that research papers and most of the recent research shows that EITI serves mainly as a signaling tool, but not a norm compliance tool, because most of developing countries try to use EITI as a tool to, for example, attract more FDI in their countries, or like foreign aid and other external sources. So it is really not a norm compliant, let's say, technique or tool, but really a signaling tool. So also these 4 country case studies may show that, especially the Central Asian countries, especially Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, as they are oil-rich countries, they mainly probably joined the EITI to attract more FDI. So there is such kind of hypothesis in the research papers. And the final question is about why did you did not consider other EITI countries, post-Soviet EITI countries, for example, Ukraine and Tajikistan are also members. So this also might help to consider post-Soviet settings better, I think. And I think it will be also more interesting to consider non-EITI countries, resource-rich countries, to compare whether there is a real norm compliance or there is just signaling compliance, let's say, if it's possible to say that. So this kind of 3 big questions, if you answer it, will be very, very good. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for the first question, no, I didn't, well, not necessarily. I did treat each case as a separate case. And I did that because each country has a particular set of, again, actors, particular process, particular, again, sector itself. So in Kazakhstan, you have both mining sector and oil and gas sector that are important. So that's important to keep in mind that. Whereas in Kyrgyzstan, it's only mining, and in Azerbaijan, it's mostly oil and gas. So you have country specificities. In my penultimate chapter in the book, I do draw comparisons and basically conclusions from what each case study can show, but also what is the common trends among these 4 countries. There are particular format that I used also in terms of, again, I used my model to follow. So each particular case is followed the same model, however, the story within it is different. In terms of signaling tool and whether it's actually a symbol of compliance or not, I don't necessarily agree with you, because I don't think, I haven't seen certainly any very credible and argumentatively a strong paper on the correlation between FDI and EITI. And I want to say that why I haven't seen it, because I think it's a very difficult job to do that. How can you prove that by joining EITI, the FDIs would increase? It's a very difficult correlation methodologically to do and establish. And there are some people that are trying to do that in different cases, but overall, if you look at the EITI and FDIs, it's difficult to establish. There's always, of course, rhetorically, it's the intention, but at the same time, how can we prove that? I think that's the question. And I would think that also, I wouldn't agree that complying to the EITI, the question is how much further countries can do. So complying to EITI is not necessarily the answer to all the questions about transparency. You know, it's only one process and one process only that the countries are doing well, but what about all the others? And there are many other transparency processes around. So then, different accountability processes and so on and so forth. So that not necessarily is the, when we talk about EITI and EITI compliance, I don't say that these countries are compliant with all the transparency and accountability processes. That's absolutely not true. What I'm saying is that these countries are compliant with EITI. And here, again, it would be an interesting discussion of, and also comparison, I think, with the other transparency mechanisms, such as, for example, open budget. None of these countries, apart from Azerbaijan, and sometimes Kyrgyzstan, is participating in open budget. So there are all the other issues or open governance around transparency, but not necessarily all the countries are involved in them. Why I haven't chosen Ukraine and Tajikistan again? And I probably should have started with that. This is not a book about post-Soviet countries, and I didn't want to do it about post-Soviet countries because I actually I have my also problematic relationship with the term post-Soviet, and basically it kind of ended up having these countries, and it was a very convenient, I must admit, way of doing field work. But on the moment when I was doing the field work, Ukraine was not part of the process, so it was absolutely out of discussion of looking at it. And Tajikistan was banned because of so they had a temporal problem in joining, rejoined later on, but it was too late to include that. Non-EITI country, I'm asked quite often, and even during doing the research, there were a lot of people were saying whether I should also look at non-EITI countries. And again, my answer to that is I look at EITI compliance. I'm not looking at about EITI non-compliance. And it's a very interesting work, and I'd love to do such work in terms of comparison. But I think it also it needs a particular type of methodological tool and framework, which is kind of difficult. So how do you compare different countries on different aspects of what would be your point of comparison? So I still haven't figured out how to do that research. So I don't know. Some of the colleagues try to do, for example, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. I've saw a paper on that. But I think it's difficult to again, to bring correlation and any conclusions that would be methodologically rigorous and theoretically rigorous to compare. So I think what would be interesting also to see how the countries that are non-EITI and then joined, what would be the difference? So how did they perform before and how they're performing now? That would be also, I think, an interesting story. But that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Aliya. It was a very, very, very informative session, and thank you for talking to us and addressing the question from the audience. I think our time is up, and so I would like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of GSPP for finding the time to talk to us and to present your book. And I must confess, I wish I had read it before, because many of the questions that came out in this debate were lingering in my head. And I thought, oh, if I had read the book, I would have received already some answers. So it was a great pleasure to meet you virtually. We hope that next year, especially when we have the GSPP conference, there will be an opportunity for you to fly here to Sultan and give us a presentation in person. But for the moment, please accept our thanks, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you very much, and thanks, of course, to all the participants.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Aliya.